Quiet in the back. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to mention for all the folks online, because we have a few, that we'll take questions in the end. I also wanted to mention that there's a sign-up sheet. There's two sign-up sheets that may be floating around. And if you could please just note your name and organization and email address if you don't already receive our newsletters. That way you'll be connected and receive continual updates about ABCG and about events like these. I think I'm going to sit because of this head shadow. So let me know if you have any trouble hearing me. I'm going to give a brief introduction to ABCG before I introduce our speaker. The Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group is a consortium of 7 international conservation NGOs, and they're here. The African Wildlife Foundation, Conservation International, the Jane Goodall Institute, the Nature Conservancy, Wildlife Conservation Society, World Resources Institute, and the World Wildlife Fund. We're currently in a grant period that began in October 2015. It goes through September 2018. That's fully funded by USAID. These organizations have been working together for a number of years to tackle conservation issues that warrant a united strategy across the continent. The mission is focused on complex and changing conservation challenges, and through collaboration and information sharing, work towards a vision of Africa where natural resources and sustained human livelihoods are accomplished in concert. And we do this through 3 main strategies for achieving the vision. First is prioritizing biodiversity conservation in international development agendas, then promoting best practices for conservation among practitioners, including local African institutions, and promoting best practices for conservation, partnering with social and development institutions to integrate biodiversity conservation into human well-being and development agendas. And then each of these strategies is applied to key themes that are supported by USAID's biodiversity policy. For this current phase 2 of the program, we're focusing on 4 thematic areas and then a 5th in emerging issues. They are land and resource tenure rights, land use management, managing global change impacts on biodiversity, which is essentially looking at human behavior in response to climate adaptation and how those behaviors are affecting biodiversity conservation. Global health linkages to biodiversity conservation, which is split into 2 areas, population health and environment, PHE, and WASH, water sanitation and hygiene. And then we have a 5th area, which is a reserve fund that we use to target new and emerging threats to biodiversity on a rolling basis through a small grants mechanism. That's about all I'll say. You can find out much more online. Please do join our listserv. We also have all the social media channels. And you can always contact me. My contact is here. I have business cards. The only other thing I'll mention is I do have also a newly developed fact sheet, so I'll pass that around. There are 20, so I don't know if it's going to cover, I'm not going to cover everybody. So if you came with a colleague, maybe you can share. It's also available online by PDF. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kimberly Holbrook from Nature Conservancy to introduce our speaker.
Great. First, I want to thank everybody for coming today. To see such a big crowd here, and to the folks on the line as well. And it's really my pleasure to introduce Craig Fleischer of the Nature Conservancy. He's our Director of Monitoring and Evaluation for the Africa region. Craig has worked for TNC for 15 years. Before coming to the Africa region, he was working as a senior social scientist in our Central Science Division, has also worked in the Asia Pacific region and for government relations team, I believe. And Craig also, before coming to TNC, has experience working at WWF, UNDP, the World Bank, among others. He's a master's in international relations from American University and has more than 60 publications, I believe. So with that, I will turn it over to Craig to talk with you about Dimini in Africa.
So I think I'm going to sit down here as well, just because the lectern seems so formal. Standing behind it is just not me so much. So I'm really happy with such a great turnout. Talking about M&E, it's a bit like a trip to the dentist. Everybody knows it's important, but nobody really wants to do it on their lunch hour. So I'm thrilled. I see we've got about 50 people or so in the room. I know we have 20 plus people online. I'm really honored that so many of you are interested enough to come out and talk to hear my talk today. So how are we doing? For the people online, can you hear me okay? Just let us know in the chat box if I'm fading out or you can't hear me as well as you hope. So if you want to learn about sort of how we decided to do monitoring evaluation for a big region in Africa, you definitely come to the right place. And by the end of my talk today, I hope you're going to have a better understanding of some of the critical choices that the Nature Conservancy in Africa made when they were thinking about how we could develop a monitoring and evaluation system for our region. So there's a lot of learning that I'm going to condense down today, and I'm happy to stay afterwards if there are particular issues you want to know more about. So I'm not going on a deep dive on any particular issue, but trying to show you the bigger picture. But I'm happy to do more afterwards. And by the end of the talk, I hope you're going to have a better understanding of the theoretical choices that we made for what kind of a framework, how we chose to prioritize which projects we're going to apply monitoring evaluation to, the choices we made about what kind of monitoring and what kind of evaluations, the indicator choices. How do we decide what we're going to measure? And I've got some data on the actual costs. What did we spend doing this? And finally, I've got some sort of ideas or I can tell you about where we're headed in the future. How we're going to roll up all of these project level M&Es into something that I hope is where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So that's the narrative arc we're going to go through today. Next slide, please. So it's really hard to say exactly where a river starts. And saying exactly where our M&E work started is also very challenging. There were a lot of different sources that came together to form our M&E River, if you will. But one of the major tributaries, to sort of keep the analogy going, was this paper from 2006 rather, by Ferraro and Pattanayak. So if you haven't read Money for Nothing, it's one of the seminal works in terms of monitoring, evaluation, and conservation. And this paper lays down this challenge, says that conservation organizations need to rigorously measure their impacts, because otherwise, are we giving money for nothing? This is one of the most cited papers, by the way, in conservation. It's a good sign, huh? Yeah. It's very easy to read too. It's not some academic treatise. The next slide, please. Let me start with why. Why Africa? Well, because many of you know the Nature Conservancy has a very large domestic program. And Africa is certainly not our largest international program. So why not start with North America? Why not start with our Latin America program, which has a lot more staff and a lot more resources? Well, I submit to you that Africa is the crucible for 21st century conservation. The crucible for 21st century conservation. Let me explain. Next slide. So this is a graph from a 2014 publication in the magazine Science. And it's the best population projections to date. And it uses Bayesian probability statistics and they run tens of thousands of iterations of this model. And they come up with probability estimates of populations. And I think it's definitely one of the best tools for looking at likely population growth. So the dotted line down the middle is where we're at today. Now the red line is Africa. Each of these different colored lines shows a different continent. So look at the Africa line. And I want you to follow it out to 2050, 34 years from now. And you see that there's a 95% probability that we're going to add 1 billion more people to Africa. It's almost a demographic inevitability. So we're going to have a booming population in Africa. Next slide, please. But Africa is also where Mother Nature, if you will, is still queen of large areas. So this is a nighttime shot of the continent. And you can see that there are a lot of dark areas. So here we have this continent that still has large intact ecosystems and extraordinary biodiversity, but at the same time we're going to be seeing 1 billion more people being born and growing up in this area. So when we're deciding what we're going to pass on to future generations from the chapters in the Book of Life, a lot of it's going to be decided right here in Africa. And I think that's why we focus on Africa, and that's why we focus on M&E, because we've got to know what works and what doesn't. Next slide, please. So why do we do M&E? I think many of you have probably seen these two reasons: accountability, learning, and these are good. These are perfectly good reasons. What I've found is they're not compelling reasons. If you come to your managers and say, we're going to put in a new M&E system because we think you need more accountability and we want to do more learning, you're not going to get a lot of buy-in. And I don't think that's the greatest benefit from monitoring and evaluation. And so here is our, and I phrase this as a working hypothesis because we haven't proven this, but this is what we hope we're going to be able to prove. And that is, if we rigorously monitor and evaluate our projects are going to be more effective, more sustainable, and more replicable. And those are the things I think that you need to emphasize if you want to get people in your organization and donors to support your work. So that's how we're framing our why we do M&E. Effective projects, sustainable projects, and projects we can replicate. Next slide, please. So where I started on thinking about an M&E system for the Africa region was learning from others. And I like this 360-degree review where you look all around you, not just up, not just down, but also peer organizations. And so I looked at, I believe it's 19 organizations that I knew were thought leaders in international development or conservation. And I'm sorry if your organization's not up here, but these are the ones I knew of, and it's a bit, it was a subjective choice. So I looked on their websites for what they're doing on evaluation and monitoring, and I specifically looked at what kind of tools that they provide. And there are 3 standout organizations, and they're the ones with the stars here, that they seem to be a bit farther ahead than other organizations. Save the Children UK, the World Bank, and the International Red Cross. So I learned 2 things from this review of what others have done. The first one was that I don't think any organization yet has a systematic and consistent way that they do M&E for every one of their projects. They often have a framework, but I don't think nobody's figured it out, in other words. So I still think there's a lot of learning that's going on. And I hope my talk today and our work contributes a bit towards moving the knowledge forward. Next slide. If you're only going to read one document about M&E, this is the one to read. Because no matter where you're at on your learning curve, there's something you're going to learn from this document. It's really well done. So it's on the International Red Cross website. You can search this title, pull it up, and see if you don't agree just how well done it is. From a lot, it's like a Walt Disney movie. It works on a whole lot of different levels, and I think that's one of the strengths of this document. Next slide, please. One of the most important choices that we made was deciding on a theoretical framework. And a theoretical framework, the way to think of it is like the frame of a house. It defines the shape of what you're going to build. And so for a monitoring and evaluation system, we wanted a theoretical framework that was going to tell us which focal areas, which specific elements we needed to focus on in order to to build a monitoring and evaluation system. Next slide, please. We looked at 5 different theoretical frameworks. Some of these you're going to recognize instantly, I'm sure, and some of them may be less familiar. But the first one was one that builds on Elinor Ostron's Nobel Prize-winning work, and it looks at robustness of socioecological systems. The second one was the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework. I'm sure many of you know that. It's been around for quite some time with the 5, sometimes 6 capitals. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, you remember that one, provisioning, regulating, supporting cultural services is their framework. And then one that's more in the ecological literature, but the driving forces, pressure, state, impact, response framework. And then finally, the Brundtland Commission's 3 pillars of sustainable development: social, environmental, and economic. I'm not going to go into each one of these and explain the pros and the cons, but in the Q&A, if you're interested on any of this, I'm happy to go deeper on why one versus another. But let me just tell you where we ended up, what we chose. Next slide, please. So we chose to go with the Brundtland Commission's 3 focal areas for sustainable development, because working on a continent where you have so many natural resources that are still there, and yet you're going to have huge population growth, sustainability seemed like the key parameter that we wanted to focus on. So we came up with this little diagram that I used to help staff understand how the different components are related. And I like this diagram because it works either way. You can start with the social, you go up through the economic, and you come to the environmental, or you can start with the environmental and through the economic to the social. But it shows this integration. And that's really what we wanted from our M&E system, that we're going to measure these 3 focal areas: the environment, economics, and social. Okay. That was our theoretical framework. Now we know what our focal areas are. But which projects were we going to include? We have 31 ongoing projects, which was way, way too many to start with. And many of these projects were small ones with, that are a year or so, and they have small budgets. So we elected to go with our largest projects by budget. So all of the projects in this have an average budget of over $1 million a year. And the most complex projects. If there were multiple partner organizations and one of them has 9 partner organizations, then that was in, because we wanted to make it work for where most of our resources are going. And we have a total of 7 projects that are in our M&E system. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it is enough. And this covers 70% of the regional budgets for projects. So it's where most of the money is going. Next slide, please. Okay, what do you monitor? There's a lot of different kinds of monitoring, and if you look at the literature, there's different things you can decide you want to focus on. So we went for bread and butter implementation monitoring, because if you do implementation monitoring, it gives you the potential to adaptively manage your project. Adaptive management has been an idea, has been a practice for at least a generation, but most projects do not, in fact, do it, because there's a lot of challenges to it. But one of the things that you need to have is the data to adaptively manage your project. So it's not in and of itself enough to do monitoring so you can do adaptive management, but it's really hard to do adaptive management if you don't have implementation monitoring. So our goal here was we want to be able to adaptively manage our projects. So we're going to do implementation monitoring. So next slide. What kind of evaluations? And this is much more organizational dependent. And there are several different categories that most evaluations fall into. There are quantitative evaluations and qualitative evaluations. And then there are, I like the USAID's terms on this one, which is you do a performance evaluation or an impact evaluation. Let me just unpack a few of those, or those 4 terms. Quantitative is about the numbers. You're measuring the numbers change. Qualitative is more about the information. You're learning about what were the factors that caused the observed changes. The performance evaluation means you're just looking at, did you do what you said you were going to do? And it usually does not involve any kind of a counterfactual. It's just like before and after, and did you achieve the goal your project set out to achieve? An impact evaluation is much more rigorous because it looks at, was it your activities that actually made the difference? And that's where you would need a counterfactual. So what we chose to do was mixed methods, but with the emphasis on the quantitative. So first we understand what changed with quantitative, and then we look at why and how it changed with the qualitative. And I'm going to talk more about how we do that in a moment. And the other thing was, we decided that any project that has a goal of replication, that one of the project's intentions is for other people to take this idea and put it in practice somewhere else, for those we needed impact evaluations. Because for a lot of donors, a lot of government officials, it's the numbers that matter. The technocrats want to see the numbers. Stories and the qualitative information is often not enough. So we elected to do impact evaluations for our project, in fact, all of our projects. And we use a BACI design. And some of you know this, maybe some of you don't. It's an acronym. Before, after, BA, and control, impact, CI, BACI. So it's a good thing to remember. BACI it comes from the ecology field, but it's a nice shorthand way. If you're doing a BACI design, you're going to be able to say something about the impact of your project. If there was no replication goal, we said, okay, then we just do a before-after performance evaluation. Okay, next slide. How do we choose indicators? How do we select them? So we started with a theory of change. What do you expect to happen? Because that's where you want to start focusing. And I really like this DFID framing that they use in the British bilateral. And that is you say if, then, because. If we do this activity, then we will get this outcome because these are our assumptions. And it's a nice, clear way to frame a theory of change. I looked at a lot of theory of change documentation, and there are almost as many ways to do theories of change as there are organizations using it. I think the DFID example is one of the best. And I'm happy to share the publication that comes from it if you're interested in that. But so we're using this if, then, because framing as the way we do the narrative theory of change. Obviously, given our theoretical framework, we are also focused on these three areas, the environmental, social, and economic. So we have indicators in all three of those areas. And all projects share a common set of indicators. So there's something about, on the environmental, about biophysical conditions. We use remote sensing a lot because it's very cost effective, but also biodiversity, your rapid biodiversity surveys, Transects. All of our projects look at food security. So why? Because it's a really well understood social indicator. There are great tools. We use the FAO one on measuring food security, and it's only a few questions in your household survey, but it's been used dozens of contexts, and we know it works. So food security is in all of our projects. Community conflict levels. We know that some natural resource projects can have a tendency to increase community conflict. So we look at whether people perceive there are more conflicts now than there were, say, 5 years ago in their community. And if they say yes, then we ask what kinds of conflicts. So we try to get a sense of what's happening over time with community conflict levels. If you see those conflict levels going up, you know you usually have issues or problems you need to address. And then the final one, you're like, what's a conservation organization? Why should they care about educating girls? Well, I submit to you, there is no more important indicator than educating girls. If there is a single lever that is going to improve people's lives, it's educating girls. So if you don't measure it, you really don't know how your project's impacting it. But if you, it's not so much primary school, it's secondary school. If you can keep girls in secondary school, they're going to have fewer pregnancies over their life. They're going to be better educated. They're going to pass that education on to their kids. They're going to have a happier life. And they're going to have more understanding of how, just a higher education level that lets them understand how their environment relates to their well-being. And so all of our projects, we look at how we are educating, what's our impact on educating girls. So that's a little twist that I just want to emphasize. And final thing on indicator selection, you want to vet it with your key partners. What you choose to measure becomes how you define success. And if your partners are not in agreement, they're not going to agree with what the results are. So you need upfront agreement on your indicators. Here's what we're going to measure. Here's how we're defining success. So that's a lesson we learned the hard way. Next slide, please. So how many indicators did we use? It varies dramatically. You can see our most complex, our largest project, the one with 9 partners, $12 million budget, a lot of moving parts. We only have 24 indicators. And I'm confident we can measure, we can adaptively manage this project with those indicators, and we can measure our impacts with those indicators. So you don't need a huge number of them. In fact, we know what happens when you have a huge number. One of the first projects we did for the M&E is a PHE project. I think some of you may know these, where there's a focus on health, environment, and there's a family planning component in them as well. And we have 131 indicators in that project. And it is rare when they actually collect all the data. And there is a lot of grumbling. There's a lot of staff that feel like this is not a great use of their time, which I wholeheartedly agree. And the data that we get are not reliable. But measuring health and specifically basic health in village clinics is complex. And our partner organization, we work closely with them for quite a few years. And they want a large number of indicators to be able to track key things like stockouts of family planning materials in village clinics, the hours that the clinics are actually staffed. So they have, of these 131, about 115, I believe, are specifically health indicators. So that's why, but it's still way too many. Bad data is worse than no data because you think you know. So, next slide. How much did it cost? Okay. So we do socioeconomic household surveys at the baseline, at the end line, or every 5 years, whichever comes first. And I'm happy to talk about why we do 1,000, because I think there's some we've learned 1,000 is about the number you want. And you can ask in the Q&A, and I'll go into that more. But this is where we have the socio-ecological indicators that we measure. So this is for our eventual evaluation. This is not so much for monitoring. But when we do these baselines, we learn so much about these communities that it helps to shape the detailed design of the projects. So you get 2-for-1 benefits with you get a baseline that you can measure against later, and also it gives a lot of great information for the detailed design. So we do them early now, before the project design is finished. Ecological baselines and end lines, as I touched on briefly, we do a lot of land cover change, NDVI and EVI. NDVI is normalized differentiated vegetation index. EVI is enhanced vegetation. Both of these are remote sensing tools that are, depending on the NDVI EVI is all free from NASA. Land cover change is free if you use the Great Forest Trends data from this organization right here, which we do. That's great for detailed. They use Landsat data on that. That's but we also have GIS experts who would do this kind of analysis for our project. And then species diversity and abundance counts, transects, etc. So we've got household surveys and ecological baselines at the start of the project. What do they cost? So we have done 9 of these household surveys now, and it's about $60,000 on average. It's not about, it's almost exactly, because I calculated the numbers. And there's a range. 30,000 is the cheapest we've ever done it. The most expensive is about 100,000. So as just a ballpark number, 60,000. That's far more than you're likely to see in many, many projects. But we do this rigorously, and it's not cheap. And I'm happy to talk about what I mean by that during the Q&A. Second, after we've done the household survey, actually, let me back up. Before we do the household survey, we do a few focus group discussions and key informant interviews, because that's how we scope the survey and decide what's going to be in it. After we've done the survey, then we go back to the villages and we present the data back. And they tell us, they validate it, and they help us understand. We know the numbers, but we want to know the how and the why behind the numbers. And that's what the focus group discussions and the village feedback sessions give you. And these average about 20,000, and we've done 3 of these so far. Ecological assessments. I mean, I'm a big believer in using underpaid graduate students for this kind of work, and so we do that a lot. And these guys, they're not expensive. So if you can get one of them, it's cheap. Our most complex project was $5,000 for a grad student from the University of Montana who did a phenomenal job. But if we pay for somebody professional to do it, it's much more expensive. So, okay. That's what we've done in the past and what we're doing sort of in the present, but here's where we're headed in the future. And maybe some of you know this, but I'm guessing most of you don't know about DHIS too. So what is it? So this is a cloud-based M&E platform. I got the website later. You can go and learn more about it. So this platform is being used by 20 plus international development organizations already in 40 plus countries. It is free open source software. The Norwegian government, the Gates Foundation, the Center for Disease Control, these are some of the big supporters of DHIS2. It was developed for the health sector originally, and now it's morphed, and they're using it in the agriculture sector and also in education. We're going to be the first conservation organization to use this platform. Next slide, please. Here's a bit about how DHIS2 works. So you can get your data inputs from a variety of different sources. Excel data or almost any spreadsheet data. But the key thing for us is it can come from a mobile phone or a tablet. So we've created forms for our partner organizations, and they can fill out that form in the field or in their office and automatically upload it to DHIS. So it makes their data entry really easy. And it sends them reminders. So if they haven't turned in their data by the due date, it'll send them a reminder. And their reminders get more and more frequent. And then you know how this works. Yeah. And at some point, then you call them and say, hey, we need your data because we need to aggregate it all. So it's a nice tool. And of course, you can still do the old-fashioned paper entry. And some of our partner organizations, that's as far as they're going to get. Once you've got it into the cloud, any internet access or any computer with internet access, you can go in and look at the data. So here's where the power comes from. is you have customizable dashboards. Each one of the partner organizations sees their dashboard, how they're doing against their targets, the deliverables they set. And at the regional level, we can roll all these projects up into these common indicators, and we can see how we're doing overall. So it's a very powerful management tool, and you can generate donor reports automatically. So you create the template, we agree with the donor, here's how we're going to report. And then the data go immediately into populate the report. So we also give the donors their own dashboard. So, and if you click on one of the dashboard icons, let's say you want to know, how many families joined a village savings and loan program last month. You can click on that data and it'll show you the details, where these people were based, who collected the data, and so you can drill down just by clicking. And it also has these very nice graphing and mapping features. It's got a very powerful GIS package in it. And it's so compelling when you can show your data spatially. You can see how your project is working, how things are happening, and you can highlight areas where you might have problems. So that's an overview of DHIS. Next slide, please. A couple more features that I'm not trying to sell DHIS in the sense that there are other packages out there, but this is the one, after we looked at about 20 different packages, we ended up doing. So offline data, that's big for us. We don't have internet connectivity with a lot of our partners. No problem. You can collect it on your mobile phone, you can collect it on your tablet, you can do it on a laptop, and as soon as it comes online, it automatically uploads. Data encryption, that's important if you're doing health stuff. And software is updated every 3 months by University of Oslo in Norway. There's a huge group of expert users, particularly in West and East Africa. There's online learning academies, there's in-person learning academies, and perhaps most importantly for what our purposes are, it's massively scalable. You can have as big a data set as you want, as many projects as you want, and you can roll them all up into one. So there's the website for you. Okay. Last slide. So this is a picture of kids in the project area with Petro. He's one of our project managers. And if you asked me to measure how high Petro jumped to the nearest centimeter, it would seem like a really daunting task. And it's like building an M&E system. When somebody says you build an M&E system, it seems like a really daunting task. But it's not that hard if you just know how to approach it. I hope I've given you some ideas of how we approached it today. So first, enter, please. So you see this yellow circle in the book the kid is holding? Well, I know how big that book is because I've got one like it. So next. So I measured, I took a line and drew it across that book. I knew it was about 5.5 inches. And then I built those lines under Petro, and I could see right where his footprints, you can see the water still jumping up. And I know this boy is on the same plane as Petro. So Petro jumped about 52 centimeters, 20 inches. Pretty good jump for Petro. We were proud of Petro. So this image went viral thanks to Nat Geo. We had 65 million people view this image a couple of months ago. So it's a beautiful picture, and I think it helps to see that, yes, it's challenging to measure something, but it's not an insurmountable challenge. So thank you. And with that, we'll end the monologue, and the part I enjoy much, much more is the dialogue. Thank you.
Questions from people in the room, and then we'll go some of them. So have microphones in front of you, so you might just have to pass them around. Yes.
How does your organization support this effort politically and also financially?
Yeah. So politically, you have to have buy-in from the top managers. but they want a management tool that is going to make their lives easier, that they can more effectively manage the project. So I've had a lot of support from our senior managers and from our project managers, because they too want to do a better job. Financially, how do we pay for it all? So we've had success talking to donors about an M&E system that's going to make our projects better. Not about learning and not about accountability per se, but about making them more sustainable, more replicable, more efficient. So we've been able to raise some money, but by and large, and that covers some of my time and some of the activities that I do that particular donors don't want to fund. But mostly we build it into project budgets. Rule of thumb is, how much money do you need for $1 million project? You need about 5% of that budget going towards M&E. It varies a little bit. If you have smaller projects, then that percentage goes way, way up. And bigger projects can come down a bit. But that's a good rule of thumb. We're about 6% now with our projects. Yeah.
Another question. Yeah.
So, for instance, you mentioned the girls' education as an indicator, but are there activities to actually address changing that metric, or is it just a metric you're measuring aside?
Both. So some projects have direct ones, but our hope is we have some indirect benefits as well. So simply by, say, increasing a fisher's income, we hope some of that spills over into sending more girls to school. We want to see, because we really don't understand the causal links. You know, why do some families send their girls to school and other families don't? And until we start looking at it analytically, I'm not sure we're going to have a good understanding in our local context of what we need to focus on. So we're just at that preliminary stage. We're starting to do some data analysis on our first project, where we have a baseline and a 5-year follow-up to look at what were the factors that led some families to send their girls to school and others not to. So, yeah, it's not a very satisfactory answer in terms of exactly how we do it, but that's where we're at.
We'll do Kathleen, and then Janet, and then over here.
You discussed about the types of monitoring and impact and implementation. I was wondering if you could give more detail and think about the importance of knowing these differences.
Yeah, sure. So, what do you focus on if you have limited resources? What do you focus on? Monitoring, evaluation. What's your guess? It's monitoring. Because if you monitor something, you can make it better. Evaluation is it's already happened. It is what it is. So if you're looking for where you're going to get the most return on your investment, you start with your monitoring. So that's one of the key points of if you have limited resources, this is what to focus on. The difference between the two. So here's the way I like to think of it. So monitoring is a management tool. It looks at are we doing things right? In other words, are we implementing this project in an effective way? Evaluation is about, did we do the right things? And I find that's a nice way to make that distinction. But in practice, there's a link between the two. Obviously, you get good monitoring, you're going to probably have better results, and your impact evaluation is going to be more successful. Does that answer your question?
So Craig, thank you very much for this presentation. It's really great to hear the thought process that the Africa program at TNC went through and to see your choices, and especially the cost, because usually we're told it's too expensive, so it's nice to see the cost. But my question is, how many of your indicators that you're talking about are sex disaggregated? And have you been able to do anything with that data to show change?
Yeah, so all indicators are sex disaggregated and age disaggregated. Okay, so you do, because you look in the epidemiological literature, these are the two things you need to disaggregate by. Gender or sex, it's a better way to say it as sex, because gender is a different construct, and age. So yes, all of it we do household rosters for all of our household surveys. And if you want to know how, we figured out how to do that with electronic tools. So we do all electronic data collection. And rosters aren't easy to do, but you can. Yeah. Okay.
It's a little unclear as to kind of where you are on the kind of design, implementation process, and the related question of how presumably TNC already has an existing M&E systems in domestic and other international activities, and so how this research and conceptualization, early implementation is influencing the rest of TNC, and how you see, to me it seems like a pilot, how you see how the institution is going to learn from that.
Yeah, inshallah. Yeah, let's hope. So where are we at in the process? So we're a little over 2 years into it. We have baselines for all of those projects. Some of the baselines I did when I was wearing another hat as a central science as a social scientist. So that's where we're able to do this 5-year comparison that we recently did. The organization does not have a monitoring and evaluation framework. We have some guidelines, but they're very general guidelines, and we really leave it up to the projects to decide what they want to do. And there's not a lot of knowledge and understanding about how to do it. So, you have to understand how your organization learns. And my organization learns by seeing a good example. Somebody's already doing it, and they can see how it would work. It's a big organization, 4,000 roughly staff, and there's a lot of decentralization. And so, if somebody comes up with a better mousetrap, everybody's interested. But until that happens, it's not a top-down kind of thing. There are some top-down, sort of priority setting activities, but for how you actually meet those priorities, very much bottom up. Let every team figure it out, and we'll come up with better ideas that way.
Hi, thanks so much for this presentation. I really like what you said about data and how that is becoming more harmful in data analysis. I'm curious, with the challenges obtaining a reliable sample size, how do you kind of audit for qualitative data internal process for that or somewhere?
So, yes, there's two things you care about with data: reliability and validity. So these are the two things. You look in the data literature. These are what matter. So reliability, what that means is test and retest. If you gave the same test again, would you get the same results? Validity means, do you actually measure what you purport to measure? Is it truly measuring what you think it measures? We do a lot on reliability. We do much less on validity because it's hard to do validity until you've got like time series data and you really can see whether it's working. So reliability, when we do household surveys, so first it's all electronic, and every night we have, so when the data get uploaded once a day, and we have a dedicated data quality person who goes through, and so we ask certain questions, we ask the same question different ways in the survey, and we would expect those answers to be the same. And if they're not, that's a red flag. And it's a simple little Excel macro that checks these things. And we also look for any out-of-range data. And so the survey software will not let you enter like 200 for the age of a person. But if somebody enters that they have like 27 children, the software will let you do that. But we flag that night, and it goes to the supervisor that night. In the morning, they meet with the enumerator, and they say, we see you put 27 down for the household size. Can you confirm that? And if it's wrong, then we update it right then. So we try to fix the problems with the data as close to the source as we can every day. And then the second reliability check we have is the supervisors go and resurvey 10% of the households every day, and they use a short checklist. We're not asking them everything again because it's unfair to the people that have just already sat through an interview. But we ask about 10 questions, that there should be a really high degree of reliability. Things like the sex of the person you were interviewing, their age, the number of people in their household. We want to see 100% correlation or agreement between what the enumerator said and what the supervisor said. And whenever there's a disagreement, then that gets flagged, and the supervisor works with the enumerator to figure out where the issue is. Does that answer your question?
I guess I'm also curious about. I'm also curious about going into the household. And I know that you mentioned that the challenge is ask the question in each way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about
So
that.
participation, we get less than 1% refusal rates. One of the cool things about working in remote rural areas is this is big news and big entertainment. They love household interviews. And you can go long on household interviews. We never go more than about an hour, and rarely that long. But people are very, very tolerant. And we don't introduce, the enumerators are usually from the local communities, and we hire the village sub-leaders to introduce the enumerators to each household, and they explain what the survey is about. So our refusal rates are really, really small, and it's a huge benefit because it lowers your cost dramatically when you're working compared to working in the United States. It's so easy.
Just on that point, I'm curious if you're using supervisors and team leaders that are based centrally and trained centrally, or if they're also global.
No, we contract for these. So they are professional survey supervisors and trainers. There are organizations that do this all the time. I think we missed your question.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. In my own restoration project, landscapes, and I'm not sure what kind of projects monitor. I'm wondering what should be included as a must, like to get the minimum, for instance, on the biophysical.
Yeah.
And we can have like broad category, hydrological, situation, soil condition, vegetation. But sometimes the question is there actually a proxy that can actually tell you something about all this, like vegetation? The other two are okay, then you would have the answer kind of. I don't know if there is any such strategy.
Yeah.
And of course, because one challenge is remote sensing, the hydrology, the soil, that's
It's not. So give me an example of a restoration project that you're interested in, that you work on.
I mean, we are really dealing with, think about how do we monitor restoration of 100 million hectares, for instance.
Okay.
There are places going on.
Yeah.
And we have been testing some tools at local level in Rwanda, Ethiopia.
Yeah.
But of course, restoration, we do say tree-based, but of course, it's mainly reviving the holistic ecosystem as the landscape.
Yeah.
It's not only about it. So it touches the socioeconomic, touches the governance, everything.
Yeah.
But I'm just picking one of the big blocks. Let's say biophysics.
Yeah.
To get some good picture that tracks change happen from this year to the next year, maybe every 5 years.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions, like what should the minimum be?
No easy answers on this one, I'm afraid. So, but I can just tell you how I would approach it, and I'm not sure this is right, and this is just off the cuff. I would look at what are the elements you need for a functioning ecosystem. What does it take? Does it take tree cover for this? Does it take healthy soils? Does it take water retention? What are the things you need? So if you can find a reference site where you have the existing ecosystem is intact and understand what are the key elements of this ecosystem. And that's where I would start to think about what you wanted to monitor ecologically. Because there's a lot of different variables. You touched on some from water, soil, land cover. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we say restoration, of course, just the people target is great. So,
yeah.
Like you said, maybe we have to get the more impact or one optimum condition of care. But I do see, of course, water, soil, and big blocks, but then you have to maybe ask it lot of variables.
There are 100 million hectares. That's a lot. Yeah, that's a big job. Yeah, I don't know you're going to find a one-size-fits-all solution.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Not. Yeah.
Sorry. So 100 million, we are not like monitoring 100 million. It's just the idea there are places Africa will reach the 100 million. But then we have to have a replicable monitoring system to track those places that happen. So we will escape. We will start with landscape.
Start with something easy. Forest trends. Use their data. It's really easy to download. Very easy to do change detection over time. Yeah. And it's cheap. Free. Somebody's time. Yeah.
I want to get to a couple questions online, and then I think we'll adjourn, and Craig will sit back and we'll get individual discussions. Aisha, do you want to do just a couple?
Sure. So this first question is from Susan Young. How do you connect the causality between socioeconomic and conservation measures?
Okay, so Susan, thanks for the question. Most people in rural areas lead interconnected lives where they live in what we call these complex socio-ecological systems, and they're already connected. So what we want to do is keep those connections, and by measuring both the socioeconomic or human well-being components as well as the ecological, then we can look to see whether there are similar patterns that you see. So, okay, I'm going to take a tangent here for just a moment, but I'm coming back to your question. So one of the reasons why they hunted whales long after it was no longer economically viable, because no one person had enough data to see the overall trend. It was such a long time series. And all they knew is that if you even got 1 or 2 whales, your fortune was made for many years. And so they kept going. So in order to be able to see the connection between the socioeconomic and the ecological, you oftentimes need long time frames. And so all we can do is start that process with good baselines, and then we monitor it over time. But in the case of whales, the average boat captain would have to be more than 100 years old. And there's a great study on this if you're interested, in order to be able to see the pattern, and it was impossible. So they kept hunting whales long after it was no longer economically viable. So it's not a direct answer, but I think we need long time frames to be able to see these connections and good baselines.
Do one more.
Do we monitor subgrantees? Yes, Anthony, we do. How do we? The same approach. They use our monitoring system, and they report on the agreed indicators that they're responsible for. Amelia asks, when it's impossible to show impact during project duration period, how does that change your indicators and your M&E plan? And this links back to the other question of longer time frames. So absolutely, in many contexts, it's going to take nature far longer to recover or to see the benefits than, say, a 5-year project. So here, all we're looking at is that we first caused no harm. We wanted sort of the Hippocratic oath, if you will, that we want to make sure then that socioeconomically we didn't make people worse off. And the other thing that we measure is perceptions. So we may not be able to measure a change in fish catch or fish densities and diversities, but it's really easy to measure whether fishermen perceive they're improving. And so that's what we often measure instead. Do fishermen get the sense that the trend is going in the right direction? And it's not an empirical measurement, and it can be wrong, but at least it gives us a sense of whether people believe the project is working, and if they do, they're more likely to support its continuation. Give it more time. Do another? Yeah.
Well, I think it's about time, actually. So I'd like to give Craig one more round of applause.